Hey everyone, it's Thorn, and in this video I want to think about labels and kind of the monikers and the words that we use to define our practices as witches. I've been watching a conversation unfold in my Discord server, Kithic, about, and yes, my Discord server is named after the coven in the Kate Tiernan sweep series, 100%. Because I'm awesome. Anyway, there's a conversation happening in Kithic right now about how we identify ourselves, and a couple of members were reflecting on their use of the phrase, or their use of the term Wiccan to describe their practice when they were a teenager versus like when they found out that like initiatory Wicca was a thing, and then folks kind of exploring the idea of what it means to be a traditional witch, and is a traditional witch different than a folk witch? And it's just been a really interesting conversation that I think involves all of us on some level, all kinds of witches. And this topic has come up in my writing and in previous videos in different forms, in the sense that you know, like words are complicated. And on the one hand, like labels, they can feel very arbitrary. They can feel like things that people erect in place to, you know, create boundaries and keep others away and like define ourselves and assert that we're different than other people. But they can also build community. Like they do lots of things. Like on the one hand, like a label can feel arbitrary. On the other hand, sometimes it can make a big difference in deciding like where you want to spend your time, what texts you want to read, etc. Labels can unify and they can build community. So anyway, given all of that stuff, I want to think out loud at you about the terms that I have used to describe my practice in the past, and then some of my own reactions to how I see people doing the same thing today. Just generally, because I think that this is something that's deeply concerning, I think, to a lot of people. One of the big questions that I see over and over and over again in beginner spaces is, what do I call myself? What kind of witch am I? Which is, on the one hand, it's a conversation about like, what is witchcraft and how do I practice it? But it's also a question about like, how do I identify? How is it safe to identify? How is it fair for me to identify? Like all of this stuff is wrapped up. And that there are related questions. So one thing that I see in particular, because I'm a Wiccan in particular, operating in Wiccan spaces, there's always that conversation about, well, who gets to use the word Wiccan? And there have been conversations in my own community that are ongoing currently about like who gets to call themselves a Gardnerian, okay? And like it's a thing that we never really grow out of. So it's worth thinking about. A couple of observations. I've made videos in the past, and I make this joke, you know, in some variation of it pretty routinely. Like there's this tendency amongst witchcraft practitioners today to almost over-identify, in the sense that like it's not enough to be a witch, now you have to be like a cosmic witch or a green witch or a sea witch or whatever. And those of us who've been around for, you know, more than like a substantial number of years, like in my case, like between 20-25 years, that can feel like a very kind of weird phenomenon to witness, especially like being as an outsider. Like I get on TikTok and there's hashtags for what seems to me like very like niche types of witchcraft that I, as an elder millennial, sometimes find very bewildering. So like that's a thing that like I've made cracks about in the past, totally. And that's a thing that I hear people talk about, like, and the argument is like, well, you know, we're nitpicking at that point, and like a witch is a witch, and if you do witchcraft, you're a witch, and a skilled witch can operate in a number of different mediums, and I'm not going to restrict myself to just one type of witchcraft. And I think that that is a worthwhile perspective. But truth be told, like the people who I've met who identify in those very particular ways, like cosmic witches or crystal witches, they're not out there advocating that they're only doing one kind of witchcraft. Like, I think some of us who have been dismissive in the past or who are dismissive now, make the assumption that what they're doing is they're boxing themselves in. And if we want to get really, really cynical, and I've made this observation myself, even recently, like, I think that there's definitely like a marketing thing happening there too, where how we identify often goes hand in hand with how witchcraft is being currently marketed in certain spaces. I don't think that that's a coincidence. So while that's still a position that I hold to an extent, and maybe it's a cynical position, I don't think that it's the whole picture. But anyway, there's this assumption that when people identify in very specific ways, what they're really doing is limiting themselves. But I think it's more complicated, because something that wasn't true about my generation of witches and prior generation of witches, and maybe even like the generation immediately after me, like millennials, elder millennials, Gen X and older, we didn't have access to the same kinds of communities. So like one of the reasons why we think of like Wicca in particular as like beginner witchcraft or like a stepping stone to other kinds of witchcraft is not because Wicca inherently is like easier or more approachable or friendlier or whatever. It's that that's what was on the shelves. We weren't presented with options. Like, you went to the Walden books at the mall and you could pretty much only buy like Buckland and Silver Ravenwolf and maybe some DJ Conway if they were like extra fancy, or you could buy like the book about how Dungeons and Dragons would lead you to Satan. Like, those were your choices. So, and we didn't have this range of options. So I've come to think more and more recently that actually the availability of labels that maybe to folks like me might initially seem like nitpicky and petty is actually this really cool marker of how people are allowed to come to know themselves and their practices, and how they can identify in really unique ways that weren't available to us previously. So I think there's a couple of things going on there. Like, I'm kind of by nature a little bit cynical, so it's hard for me to not think about like, well, people tend to identify in accordance with how witchcraft is marketed at them in any given decade. And I think that's true, in the same way that, you know, we were all Wiccans in the 90s. You know, obviously we weren't all Wiccans, but I'm making a generalization about like what was on bookstore shelves. In the same way, you know, there are certain monikers, certain descriptors of witchcraft that are very popular now, and that's what you see. But it's more than just like people limiting themselves. I don't think that that's what's actually going on. I think that maybe it's that there's kind of this grand opportunity to like come to know ourselves in more specific and deeper ways than we had conceived of previously, and that's really cool. So just an initial thought about that. The second thing I want to reflect on is how I personally have defined myself in the past and kind of the functionality of that. And this specifically came up in the conversation that I mentioned earlier on Discord about Wicca, just because this particular conversation had several Wiccans involved. So that's kind of where we were focusing. And one of the things that we sort of discovered in talking to each other was that we tend to use the descriptor of Wicca, like I'm a Wiccan witch in particular, my witchcraft is Wiccan, as opposed to some other type of witchcraft. That description is really only useful when we're talking to people who aren't operating in the same space we are. And that's been true, like as I've learned and as I've developed as a witch, as I've learned more as I've gotten older, where when I was 13, 14, kind of in teen witch mode, you know, there wasn't, because I didn't have access to the internet quite yet. I would get it very soon. I used the terms that were available in the book. Like, I knew the word eclectic, but I described what I was doing as Wicca. To me, it was Wicca, and I introduced myself as Wiccan when I was in spaces where that might potentially be relevant. When I got older and I learned about initiatory Wicca, other kinds of Wicca, when I learned about Wicca's history and kind of like how it had been described in the past and the different sorts of people who practice it across time, I I had a lot of doubt about whether or not I was allowed to use that phrase. And then on the internet, it became a really big deal where like you got to call yourself a Wiccan when you had undergone a particular kind of initiation ritual. You'd been accepted by particular Wiccan communities, and everybody else was either like playing at Wicca, or they were just, you know, they were stupid and wrong or something. There were a lot of really, I mean, it could be pretty vicious. And it's been funny watching that change over time, because I feel like in the 90s and then into the first decade of the 2000s, when I was first exploring, there was such this push. Everybody was so anxious to be allowed to use the word Wicca. And now in 2022, it's like we all are doing as much as we possibly can to distance ourselves from Wicca and make sure that people don't use the word to apply us, even if we're still kind of doing the same things. It's funny how the term can change even if your practices don't necessarily change. Like, there's just lots of interesting stuff there. But in practice, the conclusion that I've reached is that I add descriptors to my witchcraft. I describe myself as a Wiccan, or sometimes as a traditional Wiccan, sometimes as a Gardnerian, sometimes as a Gardnerian witch. Like, I will use different descriptors for myself depending on what goal I want to accomplish and who I'm talking to and how I think they will treat me based on what phrase I use. So in that sense, like if I'm just hanging out with folks like casually, right, and it's not for anything, I'm much more inclined to identify just as a witch. That's how I think of myself. In my regular practice, like in my devotional life, in my magical and religious life, I don't think very much about being a specific kind of Wiccan, or like how things fit or don't fit into like established ways that people have made assumptions about the tradition I'm practicing. I just practice witchcraft and call it a day. The labels come out when I'm in communication with other people. So I think that that's just another thing to think about. Like, when we are struggling at home in our private lives with whether or not I should be using a particular term to describe myself. Is this what I'm practicing? Am I entitled to this term? Is this really who I am? There's a lot of stuff wrapped in that. And one of the things that's wrapped up in that is how we think other people are going to perceive us. And unfortunately, that's not something that we always have a ton of control over. Maybe that's unfortunate. I don't know if I want that sort of control. But anyway, some thoughts out loud to just kind of complicate the words that we use to apply to ourselves. I do the same thing with the word religion. I really like the word religion. I think of myself as a religious person, and I don't worry too much about like what that actually means. Like, I'm a religious studies scholar. I've spent a lot of time like reading about how the word religion has been like, you know, shaped and played with over the course of many, many years, and how that word has been used to push particular agendas, keep certain people out, bring other people in. Like, it's not this cut and dry thing that we usually talk about. But I'm conscious of the fact that when I describe what I'm doing as religion, and when I use the word religious, people react in particular ways to me. And sometimes I do that on purpose, and I use that effect on purpose. So it's just words, the terms we use to apply to ourselves, often they say more about how others are going to interact with us than they do about anything inherent about our own practices. And not, like, again, thinking about Wicca in particular, like, I know people in the military who have defined themselves as Wiccan, like in their military settings, because Wicca has a certain level of like legitimacy in an American like military context because there's precedent, as opposed to describing oneself as like a witch or a traditional witch or some other kind of magical practitioner. I've seen some people just default to Wiccan because it saves them time and it grants them the particular legal protections that they need. You know, so all of this to say, like, labels are a mess, and there's a lot going on with the words that we choose and the words that we don't choose. And I think all of them are about ultimately like relationships and community and how we interact with other people. So stuff to think about. I hope you are well. This week has been trash, and I am going to paint something pretty to make myself feel better.